So occasionally I'll talk about things like software bloat and software minimalism on this channel, and you know what? I'm getting really sick of the bloat meme. So what I mean by this is that there seems to be some people who, one, think that software bloat is way more important than it really is, and two, seem to think that it is some strictly defined category that you can actually put stuff into. So that's what I want to talk about today. So if you're new to the channel, you know what to do, and let's jump right into it. So the first thing I'd like to mention is that this isn't some strict philosophy that has survived the rigor of public debate. I don't have a research paper on it, I don't have a PhD on it. This is just a set of guidelines for the way that I pick software, and it's my set of guidelines. So if there's places where I don't really care about software bloat, for example, I don't care if systemd is bloated, because that's just not something I really think about, then that's not something I'm going to address. But there are places where I do think that I can address software bloat, and I do think there's some benefit to doing it. But I'll get into why completely eliminating software bloat is just completely impossible in a moment, but let's just go through some examples. So, for example, we've got my generic bookmark manager. So, what I do is I have all my bookmarks handled within one place, and if I want to move from Brave to Firefox, all I have to do is use a new browser. I don't have to move any of my bookmarks over. All of the bookmarks just still work perfectly fine, so I don't have to even touch those. Or we've got SXHKD, which is my hotkey daemon. If I move from, say, BSPWM to DWM or DWM to i3, I don't have to change any of my key bindings except for the ones that directly relate to the window manager. Everything else, like my general application launchers and things like that, all of those will work fine. So that makes sense for a place you can eliminate bloat from. You could use the hotkey daemon in i3, or you could use the hotkey daemon in DWM, or you could use an external program to handle all your hotkeys, so it's just much easier to migrate from place to place. Or another thing is just using a window manager over a desktop environment. So the way that you're eliminating bloat here is if you just use a window manager as opposed to a desktop environment, you're not getting all of those extra programs that you might not need. If you need them, you can install them as you need them. But there's no point installing all of this junk when you're not going to touch most of it. And then there's also my text editor. Yes, I could use VS Code, and I have used VS Code in the past, but I think that using Vim, even though it's going to take a bit longer to configure, I think the benefit of using that really outweighs the time commitments that it takes to actually configure it. So this is one of the key things I wanted to bring up. At some point, removing bloat becomes very, very inconvenient. So yes, there's tons of places where I could use far more minimal programs than the ones I do. But at some point, it becomes very inconvenient to actually configure all of these, and you're not going to get much benefit from it in most cases. So, for example, why should GIMP and Kdenlive have key bindings? Why don't you just use a third-party program to actually configure the key bindings for them? Why do they have built-in hotkey daemons? Isn't that just extra bloat? Or another one is, why should you even use a window manager? Why don't you just manually assign window locations? Doesn't that make far more sense? What's the point of a window manager when you can use something far more minimal and just assign window locations? Or there's tons and tons and tons of other examples like this. And at a point, removing bloat does become inconvenient. So sure, most people will agree something like Windows is bloated. But the most important thing to think about is that a lot of bloat is very much defined from your current reference point. So if you're someone who's using Windows, Linux is far less bloated, regardless of which distro you pick. But if you're using, say, a full install of Ubuntu, then, for example, something like Void or Gentoo or Arch is probably going to be far less bloated. And if you're using Arch, then maybe doing Linux from scratch is far less bloated. You can't just instantly define something as being bloated without giving it a point to reference from. So that's the most important thing about defining bloat, at least in my eyes. So this is the most important point, really. Bloat is an opinion, and it's an opinion based on where you're looking from. So here's another example. So say you use something like ST and you want to add scroll back and you want to add tabbing to it. So what is a less bloated solution? So is it ST and the scroll back patch and tabbed, or ST and tmux? So if I don't use any of the extra features of tmux, isn't it less bloated to use the scroll back patch and tabbed? But then you're using an extra program. So maybe it's more bloated because of that, so you've got an extra process running. Or maybe it's more bloated because you're adding scrollback when you have another terminal that also does scrollback, and there might be other places where you want to add scrollback. So wouldn't tmux be less bloated there? See what I mean here? Depending on how you approach the question, bloat isn't something that you can just instantly say, oh, that's bloated because that's bloated. It's very much dependent on how you look at it and what you're actually comparing it to. Another way that you can look at bloat is a trade against convenience. So if you remove the reference point and you're just thinking about basically adding stuff to a program. So by definition, making the program bigger makes it more bloated. But because that reference point is very, very important, so if those features that are being added are features that you actually use, does it actually matter that it's bloated? So if you were going to start with a minimal installation, for example, say you use Vim, and then you compare that with something like SpaceVim, which is a version of Vim which has a bunch of plugins installed. Is SpaceVim bloated? Maybe it is. But if I take Vim and I basically turn it into SpaceVim, is that bloated? What if I'm using all the features that are in it? Is it still bloated then? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. That is the important thing here. I can't answer that question for you. The point is that it will depend on where you're actually looking at it from. So one thing that commonly crops up on my channel is I'll talk about things like terminal file managers, and someone will say something like, let's go with LF. So LF is bloated because I can do everything that LF can do with MV, CP, LS, and RM. And that's an entirely fair argument. If you want to just do that, that's entirely fine. But another way you can approach this is with the time argument. So is it more convenient to use LF? So is it more valuable to use your time more efficiently, or is it more valuable to just use the minimal program? So that's another way that you can look at bloat, the time that it actually takes to do stuff. And along with that, with the simple programs, as I was mentioning earlier, if it takes 5 hours, for example, to configure something, and you get a half-second improvement, wouldn't it have just been better to pick the more complete solution to begin with? And one example of this is with VS Code. So I think that VS Code is a really good code editor, and I entirely understand why people use it. So yes, you can turn Vim into a really good code editor, and I have done that on my system, but if you don't want to spend that time to do that, and you'd much rather just use something that's already complete, and let's just throw the NeoVim plugin on it just so you can get the Vim bindings. So is that any less bloated than just turning Vim basically into VS Code? You've saved a bunch of hours, and you don't really get much of a speed improvement from using Vim over VS Code. So does it really matter that there's less lines of code in Vim, or that Vim uses less memory? Does it really matter? As I've been saying this entire video, it will very much depend on your reference point. So configuration time is something that a lot of people don't even really consider in this. So yes, you can use minimal programs, but is it worth it? I don't know. That'll very much depend on what you think. For me, I do like using minimal programs just because it's not because they're more minimal. It's because I enjoy configuring stuff. I don't care whatsoever if it's more minimal. I use Zathura because it is a really good PDF reader. I use Vim because it is a really good code editor. I also use VS Code because there's some places where VS Code is just better. For example, getting C# completion working in Vim is a massive pain, and I do it in VS Code, and it just works. So yes, I could take 3-4 hours to try to work out how to get it working in Vim, but is my time more valuable just going with the solution that works out of the box and then just accepting the tiny time hit to actually use the program? For me, I think that for some things it is far better to just use the complete solution, even though it is going to be bigger. But that will very much depend on what you want to do on your system. So I've talked before about software pragmatism in relation to free software and why I'm not a free software guy. But this also relates to software minimalism and software bloat. So I pick the best tool for the job. It doesn't matter if it's the smallest program, if it's the most configurable program. Sometimes I do want the most configurable program. So for example, I pick BSPWM not because it's the best and the lightest window manager. I like how easy it is to configure, and I like how much freedom it gives you. And same with Vim. So Vim, there probably are smaller text editors, but I like how configurable it is, and I like how much information there is out there, and this is the most important thing for me. I don't really care in the end if it's the smallest program or anything like that. So I will happily use something like VS Code, I will happily use Brave, but I'll also happily use something like Surf. It really depends on the context that I'm actually looking at it from. I don't really care about software bloat. You might do that, and if you do and you think I'm completely wrong and software bloat is the most important thing and eliminating bloat is the most important thing in your entire life, then that's fine. Just accept that your computer's bloated and use pen and paper. Actually, don't even use pens. Pens are bloat. Use a quill. I'm not sure he could write with anything less bloated than a quill. Let me know down below what is less bloated than a quill. Yeah, that's going to be today's engagement challenge. What is less bloated than a quill? Let me know down below. So, I think that's pretty much everything for this video. So if you liked this video, then remember to smash that like button and leave me a comment down below letting me know what you think. If you're new to this channel, then remember to subscribe and ding the little bell icon down below because it'll really help the channel out. I'm now aiming for 10,000 subs, and any help be really appreciated. Up on that corner, I've got the playlist this video's in, so go check that out if you want to see other videos like this. Down below, I've got my social links, so that'll be my Telegram, my Discord, and all of that sort of stuff. So go check that out if you want to chat with me or you want to get video updates. I've also got my support links down below, so that'll be on my Patreon and various other donate links. As always, if you want to support the channel, then go right ahead and do so, and it'll be really appreciated. But you don't have to support the channel if you don't want to. And lastly, I've got my alternate video platforms. So it'll be my BitTube and my LBRY. So feel free to check those out if you want to see my videos on a platform that isn't YouTube. So I think that's pretty much everything for me, and I'm out.